first 4 verses that really deal with parenting. And now we get into something that's connected in that you're still dealing with human relationships. And we spent chapter 5 and chapter 6 so far has been dealing with marriage. It's been dealing with children, so really dealing with those relationships in the family. But then now we begin to deal with other ones, dealing with bondservants and masters. And of course, in verse 5, when it says bondservants, it's really dealing with slaves, which is not something we have here in America. But a bondservant is really just somebody who has authority over him. And so you look, and we aren't slaves in the traditional sense, but if you have an employer, you are a servant. And so here it looks and it says, bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. And then in verse 9 he says, and you masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, as there is no partiality with him. And so here you have from verse 5 all the way down to verse 9, this laying out of the employer-employee relationship, the slave-master relationship. And he says, slaves, how should you be towards your masters? You are to put a fair day's work in. You are to serve them with fear and trembling, so that you are giving them their fair due as a servant. And then masters, how are masters supposed to treat their servants? It says, give up threatening. Don't treat them with partiality, because your Father in heaven doesn't have partiality. And this brings up, of course, this is tied to the other things that we've been covering, in that we're still dealing with human relationships. And it brings up a very major point in Christian living, because there is a major concept that God has laid down for us in every relationship we have. And I have up here that Christians aren't fair. And what I mean by that is we are to be more than fair. If you do the fair thing and you have a slave and he has a bad master, what's the fair thing for a slave to do if the master is not a good man? He's mean, he's rude. Should he work as hard as he works for a good master? What would be fair? What's the fair thing? You have 2 slaves. One has a good master, the other has a bad master. The fair thing would be the good master gets more work out of the slave. And the fair thing would be the bad master doesn't get as much work out of his slaves because he's not been as good to them. And you could flip it and you say the opposite. What would be the fair thing for a master to do if he has a slave that is lazy, or he's not doing the job correctly, he's not doing what he's been bought to do? What would be the fair thing for a master to do? Well, fair thing would be for him to threaten him. Say, I have the right, I have the power, I bought you, I have the authority, and if you don't do such and such, and you don't do it now, I'm going to whip you. That would be the fair thing to do. It wouldn't be the godly thing to do. It's not the Christian thing to do. And really, throughout your Bible, this is laid out. And so I have some examples here, and I want you to think about this, because in Ephesians here, we're in that application section. That section of the book of Ephesians that lays out, this is the way you ought to live, and this is what it looks like to be God's people. And so throughout the New Testament, there are some things that Christians are to do that aren't fair. And I said, well, what happens when a wife respects an unbelieving husband? There is something that isn't fair. You have a godly wife And the New Testament over in 1 Peter chapter 3 says that if you are a godly wife and you're married to an unbeliever, you're married to a pagan man, a man who does not put God in his life, that you are to show him respect. Now that's not fair, because has an unbelieving husband, a man who cannot even bow his knee before God, has he done something deserving of respect? That's not a respectable person. And yet the Bible says, written by God, God says, you take that man who doesn't even believe in me and you give him respect. And so, and then it goes on to talk about what happens with that. It says that you can change him. You can win his soul over with that. Colossians 3 talks about a husband. It says, husbands, do not be embittered against your wives. Now, there are husbands out there that are embittered against their wives undeservedly. But then there are other husbands that are bitter husbands, and you've seen them, and you look at this man and he's embittered against his wife, and then you look over at his wife and you go, yeah, I don't blame you a bit. You say, yeah, she is not a good woman. What does the Scripture say a husband should do if he's married to an unbelieving or an unkind and unlovable woman? It says, love her. And the Scriptures say that's a command to the husband. Husbands, love your wives. And you notice when God gives that command, He says, husbands, love your wives. Is there any clause on that? Husbands, love your wives unless they are really irritating. No, it just says husbands, love your wives. And it's the same with the wife. Wife, submit to the husband. And it specifically points out even the unbelieving husband. So where's the clause? There's no clause. Show him respect. How about a parent who commits to training an unruly child? Proverbs 22 says that parents are to train their children up and that there's foolishness in them. So you go to train a child and you go to teach this child about how to live, and there's going to be a time where that child is unruly and doesn't want to listen. And so here's the parent, and they've taken time out of their life. They've worked hard. They provided for this child physically, emotionally, spiritually, and the child goes, I don't want it. Of course, this happens a lot of times. We see this happening in those teenage years where all of a sudden that rebellion kicks in. And so what happens when a parent stays committed to that child even though the child says, I don't want to have anything to do with you anymore? Well, what we see in the Scriptures is that when the parent does the godly thing, now is that the fair thing? You get a 13, 14-year-old and you've provided for them for 14 years of their life. You put food on their table, clothes on their back, and not only any old clothes, you bought the dumb logo clothes they wanted. You know, it had to be a certain type, and you took care of them. You provided for them. You tried to teach them, and then all of a sudden they hit 14, and they just say, I think you are the dumbest person on the planet. What would be the fair thing for a parent to do at that point? You grab them by the scruff of the neck and you throw them out the door. You say, okay, I gave you 14 years and you haven't figured it out, so you're done. That would be the fair thing to do, but would it be the godly thing to do? So what I want you to see is that in the Bible we have this commandment that fits into every relationship, which is don't be fair. And this is important for us to understand because most of the time when we are dealing with other people, when they hurt us, the first thought we have is, oh, they deserve, I don't deserve that. That wasn't fair, and we get those thoughts immediately in our mind. That's the first thing to hit us. And yet, when you're a Christian, is the way you interact with people about being fair. If it were about being fair, what would you do to the kid? Out you go. What would you do to the wife? I think I put the graphic up there a while ago, the two people bickering, and the wife said, if I were your husband, you know, or if you were my husband, I'd poison your soup. And he says, if you were my wife, I'd eat it. And, you know, that would be normal. It would be fair to be embittered against somebody, but it wouldn't be godly. You have down here the other side of the coin. We've seen here in Ephesians 6, what does the Bible say that children should do to their parents? You should honor them. Children, well, what happens if you have parents that are not Christians? Should you honor them anyways? Should you treat them with respect anyways? You notice the Bible doesn't put a clause on that, does it? And so here you have a child, and he's, especially when they hit grown-up age, a grown child, and they have faithless parents, does that child still attempt to show honor to them? Now, I understand there are going to be situations where you have to choose between God, or they're going to make you choose between them and God, and in which case the choice is simple. But I'm talking about the average person. When you grow up, do you ever have a day where you go, my parents are dumb? Why do they do that? Why do they think that way? Why do they act that way? It's funny. I've got, at this point in my life, I've got the 3-generation thing with my grandmother, my father, and then I. And so as you look at it, my dad will look at my grandma, who's now, they built an addition, she's living right there with him, and she does weird things. And he looks at it and he goes, and he'll turn to me and says, God, Mom is weird. She does crazy things. What? We had to put a landline in. She has a cell phone. I told her I'd give her unlimited minutes on the cell phone. She goes, no, I need a landline. And so we had to, and he did. He had to pay extra money, get a landline brought in just for her. And it drove him crazy. But you know what he did? He put the landline in. Well, why? Honors Mom. And then I have my father, and I love him to death, but he does crazy things. Do you know my dad cannot drive somewhere and drive back the same route? I was so confused as a child growing up. When I had to learn to drive, I did not know that you could drive somewhere one way and drive back the same way. I didn't know you could do that. Because my dad has this habit of he'll drive one way, and I don't know whether it's boredom or what, but he'll then decide to drive back a different route. My grandpa would complain about it when they first moved into Washington. He'd say, I'm lost. Larry, I'm lost all the time. And because he... Now, there are times it's infuriating because we're in a hurry and my dad's got to drive the scenic route. And yet, what should I do? I'm sitting in the car. We're running late. The women are waiting for us back at home. They told us to go and get the groceries, and the food's cooking, and I know they're going tick, 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 and my dad's decided to take a a left turn past Topeka. And you sit in the car, and you show honor, even though it's weird. And so you see, generationally, it's still the same. And guess what my kids are going to do? They're going to do the same thing. Dad won't use the holographic phone. Why won't he use the holographic phone? He says he will only use the old-fashioned cellular phone. And there will be some weird thing about me that will irritate them, and yet hopefully they will show me honor. And so I just point this out. What is the fair thing to do when you have parents and they get to that age where they start making weird decisions? You just tell them, no, you're crazy, off to the home with you. But no, wait a second. That's not the way God designs it. Children should honor their parents. How about a servant with a ruthless master? Now over here in Ephesians it says that a servant should work for his master, but over in 1 Peter chapter 2, it says, it goes one step farther in 1 Peter 2. If you look over there, down in verse 18, it says, servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. So you have, in our lifestyle, in our culture, you don't have the slave thing, but you do certainly have the employee thing. So you are an employee, and your employer is not a good and gentle employer the way he ought to be. He's harsh, he's rude, he's mean. He never sees any of the good you do. He only sees the bad things you do. He's at all moments, you just feel like he's just ready to fire you. How do you work for that guy? Well, you're free to go and look for another job, but as long as you're working there, what should you do? Well, you serve him. You say, but that guy's not worthy of service. He's not worthy of my best. He just stomps on it. He treats me like a nothing. He doesn't give me any value. I mean, he doesn't even once say, hey, good job. I understand that. But what does the Bible say we should do? Not the fair thing, but the godly thing. And so as we look at this, the Bible is full of examples like this. You have a master, and he has a lazy servant. Well, the easy thing to do is threaten, put fear in him, show your anger, and yet the Bible says, no, hold off threatening. Show a calm demeanor. Be a peaceable person. That doesn't mean you don't tell them what to do and that you don't say there's a job that needs to be done, but you do it with a calm disposition. You don't drop the hammer and the iron fist. And so here as you look at it, when you have the employer and he treats his employees with respect and he treats them as if they're human beings, even when they're not doing what they ought to do, it's not necessarily fair to do that, but it is right. Bible goes farther and it says when we show kindness towards those who are hostile. Matthew chapter 5 talks about when somebody slaps you on the cheek, what do? Well, turn the other cheek. Somebody asks to go with you 1 mile and you say you go with them 2. And so you have this biblical picture of Christians being above the standard of fair. Not only are we doing what is expected of us, but we're doing beyond what is expected of us. We're in those times where people go, I wouldn't blame you if you lost your cool. I wouldn't blame you if you left him. I wouldn't blame you if you chucked that kid out the door. I wouldn't blame you if you... And when society is saying, well, sure, I wouldn't blame you if you did that, that's where Christians can really shine because they don't do what most people do. 1 Peter chapter 2, down in verse 17, it talks about honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. In the political realm, how often have you ever seen a politician you didn't feel like honoring? What does the Bible say? Honor the king. And then it says honor all people. Well, are all people deserving of honor? I mean, are all the people you run across in life deserving of your kindness and your respect and you giving them that kind of deference that you give people of quality? Is everybody deserving of that? No, absolutely not. Some people are not deserving of your honor. And yet the Bible says honor who? Honor all people. And this is what happens. See, when we do these things, when we as faithful Christians, because if you go back over and look in Ephesians chapter 6, look down in verse 7, it says, with goodwill doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he's a slave or free. So why do we do this? Not because it's fair, not because it's right, but because it's what God wants us to do. Because we're servants of the Lord, not of men. When we do that, God says some things begin to happen. So in every relationship in your life, when you say, I'm not going to worry about giving the person what they deserve, I'm going to worry about giving the person honor in whatever realm it is because I'm a servant of the Lord. Well, Romans 12 says what happens is you begin to heap coals on their head, which is a very wonderful thing. It doesn't sound wonderful, but it is. Because what you're doing is you're taking somebody who is disrespectful, unloving, harsh, lazy, all these different things, rebellious, and instead of treating them the way they deserve, which what happens when you treat somebody the way you think they deserve? First of all, you're not right most of the time. And second of all, when you treat them the way they deserve, guess what they start doing? They go, oh, and they fight fire with fire. And they hammer right back into you. Well, Romans 12 says when you treat people with kindness and you don't take your own vengeance, but you leave that in the hands of the Lord, instead what happens is you heap coals on their head. You hurt them in a way that they don't know what to do with. See, if you are yelling at me and I yell back at you, you know how to handle that. That's an easy thing to do. You just continue to escalate and we'll just see who can yell the loudest. But what happens when somebody is showing unkindness and you return it with kindness? All of a sudden the person is totally caught off guard. All of a sudden now they're stuck. And now it starts to hurt. It's not fun anymore to be harsh. It's not fun anymore to be disrespectful, to be unloving. It hurts. And so you begin to heap burning coals on their head. And you're heaping those coals on their head in a way that is useful. Because when you yell at somebody who's yelling back at you, You may be hurting them. You may be able to come up with some words that really bite. Human beings are really good at twisting the knife. We come up with the worst things in the spur of the moment. You may be able to come up with some things that will hurt them, but it won't hurt them in a way that will improve them. At the end, all they'll think is, that person hurt me and I don't like them. Whereas when you do good to somebody who's doing evil, what you do is you heap coals on their head, you hurt them in a way that makes them think, I am not making good choices. This person is being kind to me and I'm being mean, and it hurts them in a way that makes them think maybe they ought to change their life. And so you bring pain into their life, but it's a healing pain. Right? It's the difference between taking somebody and slashing them with a knife and a surgeon taking a scalpel. Both cut the person, but the surgeon cut the person for the benefit of doing good, to help the person long run. And Romans 12:20 says that's what you do. You begin to heap coals on their heads. You hurt them, but in a way that a surgeon hurts somebody when they're cutting the cancer out. Ephesians chapter 6, down in verse 9, it points out with a master, when a master treats his slaves well, it says, and you masters do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven and there's no partiality with him. When you are somebody who has the power to cause harm to another human being, and you even are in a point where you could justify it. You have the master with the lazy slave. Who's in charge? The master or the slave? The master's in charge. He could very easily just obliterate the guy, just absolutely hammer him down, maybe even physically abuse him because of the position that he's in. But instead, by not doing that, you show that you are somebody under authority as well. Well, who are you under authority of? When people see us treating other people in a godly fashion, they begin to ask, why would they do that? And there is only one answer why somebody would treat another human being in a godly fashion. It would be because their master is God. And so you begin to send a message that's the really important message that somebody needs to hear. You know those times where you're having conversations with people, or there are conversations going on around, and you're thinking to yourself, how do I bring up the things that are important? You know, people start talking about religion, and you're thinking, how do I move this conversation to the important stuff? Well, Ephesians 6:9 says that's when we are the kind of people that live our lives in an unfair way. We do more than fair. We do the right thing, the godly thing. You've begun to change the conversation. Because now the servant no longer says, boy, I've got a nice master. He says, I have a godly master. And the word God gets introduced into the conversation. Now we begin talking about the things that really matter. You receive a reward from God. Well, this is pointed out here in Ephesians, but it's also pointed over in Colossians chapter 3. If you look over in Colossians 3, down in verse 23, it says, whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. For you serve the Lord Christ. Well, you look there. Where do I really want my reward? See, the truth is that in most human relationships, when somebody offends us and we get ready, I'm going to lash back. I'm going to fight fire with fire. What we're really looking for is that momentary reward. I want to feel, you hurt me and I'm going to feel better. And the way I'm going to feel better is by making you hurt. And so I'm going to take the pain that you brought on me and I'm going to bring it back on you. Well, what's that? We have a word for it and it starts with a V. It's vengeance. And so when I do that, I do get my reward, but where do I get the reward? I get the reward here and now, and it's a physical reward of momentarily causing you pain, and it doesn't do anybody any good eternally. But when we take and we show forbearance with people, we show patience, we show honor to people who are dishonorable people, we show kindness to people who are being unkind to us, we show love to people who are acting in an unloving fashion, we show respect to those who are being disrespectful. What we're doing then is we are now receiving a reward, but where do we get it from? We don't get it here, we get it, it's a heavenly reward. And Christ talked about this. He says, store up for yourself treasures where neither moth nor rust destroys. And the tendency is in human relations, a lot of times, if we're not careful, especially in the times of friction, we store up our rewards here and now because we decide, I'm going to lash back at the other person. I'm going to fight fire with fire, and we go for the instant gratification reward of causing them pain instead of the long-term eternal reward of saying, no, I'm going to do the bigger thing because there's a bigger thing on the table. There's eternal rewards to offer. If you think about it this way, every time you have some sort of relationship with another human being and there's friction, you at that moment of friction, when something happens and it hurts you in some way or another, you have two tables to pick from, you can eat from. You can eat from the momentary pride of life table, where I will lash back and I will get that feeling of venting. Or you can eat from a table that will feed you forever. You can eat from those eternal rewards. If somebody came and told you that every day you will get to make one decision, and every day you will have a chance to make a decision, and you can either choose to get a Big Mac, or you can choose something that you can't get it now, but in 10 years will be $1 million. What would you choose? Would you choose the Big Mac or the 10-year wait for the $1 million? See, when you put it that way, everybody goes, I'd take the $1 million. A Big Mac is for now, and you will regret it later. But the $1 million, that's a big payoff. And so that's really what God says. He says that when you step back as a human being in relationship with other human beings, and you do the better than fair thing, you are investing in something that nobody can take away from you, regardless of how they react. And you notice that? Here in Colossians, when it's talking about how we interact with other human beings, it doesn't say anything about how the person reacts to you being kind. So there's somebody who's being mean and unloving and ruthless to you, and you react in a kind fashion, and they stomp on your heart and they crush you. Well, guess what? You still get the reward. You notice that? The reward is not dependent upon the other person's reaction. Now, hopefully, some things will kick in and the person will change, but if they don't, does it matter? You still got that eternal reward waiting for you. Now, the other thing is in 1 Peter chapter 2, he points out that you get another payoff. Now, this is when he's been talking about wives with unbelieving husbands. In 1 Peter chapter 2, down in verse 18, excuse me, I'm going to talk about wives, blow the wives one away. This is about honoring all people. I got the verses mixed up in my mind. So verse 17 says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. So once again, how are you to behave? Towards all human beings, even the harsh ones. For this is commendable if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. Now here is something that is a huge payoff to being more than fair. Not giving the person what they deserve, but doing the right thing. The godly thing is, you get to sleep well at night. Because that's exactly what he says there. It's commendable if because of conscience toward God. See, each of us has a conscience. And here's the problem. Even if you are in an argument with somebody who's a really mean, nasty person. Okay, so we have Lowell over there, and everybody knows how mean and nasty he is. And so you have Lowell. That was funny, by the way. None of them laughed. You may have to be worried a little bit. Nobody even laughed at that. Yeah. So you have mean and nasty Lowell, and him and I are having a conversation, and so Lowell just lays into me. Well, he's mean and nasty. What does he deserve? Well, he deserves mean and nasty. But the problem is I'm a nice, peaceable, wonderful guy, which is not a joke. So you have, if I treat him the way he treats me, guess what? He may sleep well because he's mean and nasty and has a seared conscience. But if I treat somebody else mean and nasty, what happens? And we've all done it. We said a whole bunch of things, and we thought, they deserved it, and boy, they had to come in, and I said just the right thing, and boy, people think about saying that stuff, and I actually did it this time. And then you go home, and about 10 minutes later, what happens? You start feeling bad. Your conscience kicks in because you are a good person. You want to do the right thing. You are a servant of God, and you realize, I didn't make the right choices. And so your conscience bothers you, and you don't sleep well at night. But instead, when you forbear and you do the honorable thing, you do the godly thing of doing what is right, even though it's not what they deserve, Peter says you get a clear conscience. You bore up under suffering, and because of your conscience toward God, you endure grief. And so you get to go, well, I go home, and yeah, that really hurt, but I don't have to be upset about what choices I made. So I may be upset about how somebody else treated me, but I don't have to worry about the choices I made. I can sleep well saying, I did my best. I guess I can leave it at that. I guess I can be okay. As opposed to that feeling when you realize, no, I didn't do my best, and I lost it. You know, whether it be some, mean comments you made, or even just the looks you gave them, or something like that. When you didn't do what you ought to have done, your conscience will bother you. And so God tells us one thing that you get out of this deal as a Christian when you interact with other people in the way that you ought to, is that you get to sleep well at night. And that's a pretty big payoff, because there's a lot of people here in America who do not sleep well at night. There's a lot of people on this planet who really are torn up every day and every moment about the life that they're living and where they're going. And so you can know with clear conscience, I did what I ought to have done. Another thing points out in 1 Peter chapter 3, here's where it talks about wives. It says, wives, likewise be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. I think the interesting thing here is that these men are won by their wives. And how are they won? It says without a word. She actually did the godly thing by shutting her mouth, because he deserved her lashing out at him, but she didn't. And so here of course is the greatest reward of it, is that we may win some souls over the thing. When you act in a godly way instead of the way everybody else does, which is they do what's fair. They treat their friends nice and their enemies mean. When you do the godly thing, which is you treat your friends nice and your enemies nice, you win some souls. You make an impact. People see that, and it changes people because of it. And so, as we've been going through here in Ephesians, I know we've kind of digressed a little bit here, but really this is the point, as it's been talking about husband and wife relationships, parent relationships, and now in Ephesians chapter 6, the slave and the master relationship is, we're talking about people dealing with other people. Well, what's God say about the subject? Don't give people what they deserve, give them better. That's really God's message on it. Give people more than what they deserve. And the New Testament really sums it up when it says, give people preference. You're treating people in a preferred position, whether they deserve that or not. Now, in Ephesians 6, down in verse 7, and then we'll move into the next part of Ephesians here. But in Ephesians 6, down in verse 7, he clarifies it by saying, with goodwill doing service as the Lord and not to men. The trick to this whole thing is you can't cheat it. It has to be done with goodwill. So I can't... when you have up there Romans 12:20, it says heap coals on their head. If you do kind things and good things to your enemy, you'll heap burning coals on their head. If you do it to heap burning coals on their head, it doesn't work. So if you go about it from the standpoint of, I'm going to be so nice to that person, I'm going to be so nice that they're going to really finally hurt. Don't do it like some formula or equation to hurt people. It has to be done out of goodwill. It has to be done out of sincerity. You have to actually be trying to serve other human beings as if you were serving the Lord and not men. So this is what makes it really so tricky. Because when you start talking about your relationships with other human beings, what is our tendency to want to do? If they're mean to me, I'm going to be mean back. So it's all about retraining ourselves to remember that in every human interaction that we have, and I say this as somebody who is not good at it at all. I'm working on it just like everybody else is. In every human interaction that we have, we say, I'm going to serve as the Lord. I'm serving the Lord, not men. And so I'm going to, out of goodwill, I'm going to do kind things for people. And I can't just simply do it. I'm going to do good and kind things expecting good things in return. Because then what happens? What happens the first time I say, okay, I'm going to do a bunch of nice things to people. I've decided I'm going to change it. I'm going to do a bunch of nice things to people. And And we kind of have subconsciously in the back of our mind, I'm going to do a bunch of nice and good things for people, and by the end of the week, they're going to start treating me nicely. We have that in the back of our mind sometimes. So I'm going to change my behavior to be nicer, and then I expect them to match that, but the problem is what happens? It doesn't actually work. So there are going to be some people that treat you meanly no matter what. So you can't do it for that. You've got to do it because it's the right thing to do. And that's what makes it so hard. And so here as we go through Ephesians and you talk about husbands and how they treat wives and how they treat husbands, and you have servants and how they treat masters, and masters how they treat servants, and parents and children and parents, how do you deal with that? Well, you have to get in your mind that I am serving a higher calling. It's not about what I get in return, because I'm going to get it where? What did Colossians say on it? Where you receive your reward? It's an inheritance from God. And so, like I said, I digressed a little bit, but I think it's worth summing up this section of Ephesians as we deal with those human relationships, because it's a very big deal to God that we be the kind of people that don't just treat our friends friendly, but we treat all of mankind in a godly way. It's in the Sermon on the Mount that Christ points out, love your enemies. So one of the greatest sermons ever preached on this planet involves in it there, love your enemies. That's a concept that God wants us to get deep within our hearts and our minds. Anybody have any comments or questions before we move forward? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Being in prison, writing this stuff under the direction of the Holy Spirit, and experiencing a lot of what we see that they had to go through at that time.
Yep.
It almost becomes unfathomable for me to even think about. I'm sitting here writing this stuff, enduring this.
Yeah. No, you've got a very good point. Yeah, I mean, the context of this is a letter that Paul wrote while imprisoned. And so here's a guy unjustly in prison. That's a real, I never thought about that, Dave. I thought about this so many times, and I know when he wrote it and all those things, but it never struck me until you just said that's exactly the case. He wrote this while in prison. Being treated unjustly, he told us, be better than fair. Don't do what they deserve. Do better. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Thank you. Anybody have any other comments or questions? Okay, so then we move down to verse 10. And in verse 10 and 11, we begin a new section, and it's a very big section. Normally, as you're getting into the last chapter of a book, you would expect about this point that we would begin to kind of hit those concluding remarks and slow down, and it'll be over quickly. The last chapter tends to go quickly. And yet, in Ephesians 6, we have some of the most poignant verses in Ephesians here when we begin to cover the armor of God. And so, Ephesians 6:10 says, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and the power of His might. Put on the full armor of God." And, of course, how is this tied to what we've just covered? What did He just tell us to do? Be better than normal people. When people treat you unjustly, you be fair, you be kind, you be loving. When people are harsh to you, you be gentle. When people are unloving to you, you be loving. When people are disrespectful to you, you be respectful. And so here's all these things He's laid out. I want you in every human relationship you have to treat people better than they deserve. And you can almost imagine the Ephesians doing exactly the same thing we're doing, which is, how can I possibly do that? How could I possibly become that kind of a person? And it reminds me of the man that was talking with Christ, and he says, I have faith, increase my faith. How could we possibly do that? And so Ephesians 6:10 moves into a section that says, this is how you do it. This is the armor that prepares you for that combat. This is the gear that you need to wear to live that kind of a life. And so in Ephesians 6:10, finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and the power of His might. So you need strength, you need power. Paul told Timothy, he says that God has given us a spirit of power and love and discipline, not a spirit of timidity. And so here, same thing. God expects us to be powerful people, courageous people, strong people. So how do you get that way? He says, I need you to put on some armor. I want you to put on the full armor of God. And so this is where the wellspring of our strength comes from as Christians. It's not from any human hands. It is not from our own intellect. It is not from our own talents, which, let's be honest, where do we tend to derive our strength from? I get it from my talents. I get it from my own mind, my own thoughts. I do what I think is best. That is the way we tend to work. We find strength in ourselves, and we've even been taught to do that as Americans, that pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which in some ways is a very good thing, but in other ways it can get into our mind that who is the strength of my existence? Me. And yet here he says, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. Don't get your strength from yourself. Go and ask for some help. And so he says, put on the full armor of God. And so that's what we're going to begin to look at, and really we'll begin to look at it starting next week because we're almost out of time here. But preparing ourselves to put on that armor. We've got to become people who arm ourselves with the tools that God gives us. And so it's no longer about winging it through life. And I'm going to do what I think is best, and I'm going to make the decisions that I think are the best. I'm going to prepare myself ahead of time to make good decisions. I have up here a couple of verses that are kind of worth considering. We'll just take a look at these real quick before we finish up class. But over in 1 Samuel chapter 30, over in 1 Samuel 30, it has this story of David. And this was... David had left his family behind, and he'd gone off to war, and all of his mighty men had gone with him, and then they came back from the battle, and the city that all of their family lived in had been besieged, and the women and the children had been carried off. And so everybody is, as you can imagine, just absolutely grieved beyond measure. And you can imagine, a couple hundred men coming back, maybe more than that, maybe a couple thousand men coming back, and they come back to town, and the city's on fire. And they go and they see, and their families are gone. They've lost everything. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 30, it reiterates this story. It says, David and his men came to Ziklag, and on the third day the Amalekites had invaded the south, and Ziklag attacked Ziklag, and the south and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women of those who were there from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but they carried them away and went their way. And so David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, their daughters had been taken captive, and David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept till they had no more power to weep. And then it talks about how David's wives had been taken captive. And it says, now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Now, in one of David's darkest moments where he thought he had lost everything, and now not only had he lost everything, and he's grieving the loss of his family, but all of his other mighty men are turning and they're saying, we blame you, David. You're at fault. And they're talking of stoning him. Where did David find the strength to keep moving? He says he found that strength in the Lord. Now we can continue, we're out of time here, but you look at some of these other verses, and throughout the Bible, that's the case. Those who are truly strong, they find the strength in the Lord. And so that's our job as we look at that full armor of God, is to say, I'm no longer in the darkest hours of my life or in the toughest times or even in the times of prosperity going to turn to myself and say, I can handle this. I'm going to now say, I'm going to do it God's way and put on that armor of God. And so starting next week, we'll begin to look at the various pieces of that armor. Anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, then we'll stop there and pick up in verse 12 next week.